Welcome to your deep dive. Wow, you've really outdone yourselves this time. You've given us a whole collection of Old Testament stories. We're talking creation, floods, family drama, journeys, laws. You name it, we got it. It's pretty amazing how these ancient texts can still feel so relevant even today. I'm ready to uncover some serious wisdom.
Yeah, I agree. These stories are like threads woven into the very fabric of Western culture. We'll be exploring some pretty big themes like faith, justice, family, and the consequences of our choices. They all resonate just as strongly now as they did thousands of years ago.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, shall we? The creation story in Genesis. What always gets me is how structured it is. It's like a step-by-step blueprint, from light and darkness to the sky, land, sea, and all those creatures that inhabit them. So, what's the significance of this order, would you say? And how does it set the stage for everything that comes after?
It is fascinating, isn't it? It's not just about creating things, though. It's about establishing order and purpose. Notice how after each stage of creation, God declares it good. He's emphasizing this idea of divine intention, of harmony. It's like setting a foundation for understanding the world as inherently good, created with a plan and a purpose.
I see. So this idea of inherent goodness makes the story of the Garden of Eden even more interesting, right? We have Adam and Eve living in paradise, but they can't resist that temptation from the serpent to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What are some of the ways people interpret the serpent's role? Is it pure evil, or is there more to it than that?
That's a really great question, and honestly, it's one that scholars have been debating for centuries. Some definitely see the serpent as a representation of pure evil, like a tempter who leads humanity astray. But others see it as, well, maybe more of a symbol of wisdom or knowledge, although it does seem to come with a price. It's interesting to think about how these different interpretations can change how we understand the story.
For sure. It makes you wonder about the nature of temptation itself. What are your thoughts on the symbolic meaning of the forbidden fruit? Is it simply about disobedience, or is there a deeper meaning at play here?
Well, the forbidden fruit is often seen as a symbol of knowledge, right? Particularly the knowledge of good and evil. By eating the fruit, Adam and Eve, well, they gain awareness. But they also experience shame and a sense of separation from God. This raises all sorts of questions about the nature of knowledge and the potential consequences of seeking it without, I guess, understanding its full implications.
That's a good point. And it's not just about them gaining knowledge, right? It leads to their expulsion from paradise. Do you see that as a punishment, or is it something else entirely?
That's a fascinating point. It could be seen as both, couldn't it? It's a consequence of their actions, sure, but also maybe a necessary step in their journey. Leaving the garden, well, it represents a movement away from innocence. It's stepping into a world where they have to grapple with the complexities of choice, responsibility, and of course all the consequences that come with them. It's kind of like a transition from childhood to adulthood, where you have to learn to navigate a world that's no longer sheltered and protected.
I like that. That's a great analogy. Okay, so we're moving from this idyllic garden setting to a world where humanity is clearly struggling, which brings us to the story of Noah's Ark. Why do you think these flood narratives show up in so many cultures? And what's the significance of the rainbow in the biblical account?
Well, flood myths are found all over the globe, aren't they? They often symbolize chaos and destruction, but also cleansing and renewal. In the biblical narrative, the flood represents God's judgment on a wicked humanity. But it's not just about destruction, it's also about a new beginning. Noah and his family, they represent a remnant of humanity that's given a second chance. And the rainbow, well, it becomes a powerful symbol of hope, like a promise from God that he won't destroy the world in the same way again.
Yeah, like a symbol of reconciliation after a period of intense turmoil. Speaking of promises, the story of Abraham's covenant is a pivotal one. God calls Abraham to leave everything he knows and journey to a new land. And he promises to make him a great nation and bless all families through him. What resonates with you about this story?
Honestly, what strikes me is the immense trust and obedience Abraham displays. I mean, he leaves his home, his family, his entire way of life based solely on God's promise. It's a huge leap of faith, one that speaks to the power of belief and the willingness to follow a path that's uncertain, but ultimately guided by something greater than himself.
And of course, his faith is tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and God asks him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. This story is so intense. How do you interpret this test of faith, and what's its significance within the broader narrative?
It's definitely a deeply unsettling story, one that challenges our understanding of God and faith. Abraham's willingness to obey, even when it seems impossible, speaks to the depth of his devotion. But, it also raises questions about the nature of sacrifice and the limits of obedience. The fact that God provides a ram to be sacrificed instead, It underscores his mercy and reinforces the idea that he didn't desire human sacrifice.
Yeah, and this theme of covenant, this binding agreement between God and his people, it becomes a cornerstone of the Old Testament, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The concept of covenant establishes a relationship that's built on promises and responsibilities. It's a two-way street, with both parties accountable to uphold their end of the agreement. This idea of a covenant, though, it resonates even today in our own lives. Think about the promises we make in relationships, the contracts we sign, the commitments we hold dear. These are all forms of covenants, agreements that shape our interactions and hold us accountable to each other.
Speaking of promises and legacy, the Old Testament is full of these fascinating stories about family relationships. And let's be honest, sometimes they get pretty messy. What's one story that stands out to you as particularly relevant to the challenges families face even today?
Well, the story of Jacob and Esau immediately comes to mind. They're twins, but from the moment they're born, they're locked in this rivalry for their father's favor and inheritance. Jacob, the younger brother, he's portrayed as cunning and ambitious, while Esau is impulsive and headstrong. The story explores themes of sibling rivalry, parental favoritism, and the consequences of deception, themes that are, unfortunately, still relevant in families today.
It's interesting how these stories, written thousands of years ago, can still feel so relatable. It's like we're looking into a mirror and seeing our own family dynamics reflected back at us. Yeah, it's like those universal themes of competition and ambition, timeless no matter what era you're in. And we see those same dynamics play out in the story of Joseph, right? Here's a guy who's sold into slavery by his own brothers. Talk about a major betrayal. I mean, he could have easily just let bitterness consume him, but instead, he rises to power in Egypt. What's the message here for us? What do you think?
I think Joseph's story is really a testament to resilience, to forgiveness, and the power of trusting in a greater plan. Even when faced with, well, unimaginable hardship, he chooses to focus on his abilities. He uses his skills to navigate a really challenging situation, and his ability to interpret dreams. Well, that ultimately elevates him to a position of influence. And then, when his brothers arrive seeking aid during a famine, well, he has that opportunity for revenge, doesn't he?
Yeah, but he chooses forgiveness instead. It's an incredible act of mercy, especially considering what he went through.
Exactly. Joseph's story reminds us that even when we're facing, betrayal and adversity, we still have the power to choose forgiveness and compassion. It's not about diminishing the wrong that was done. It's about freeing us from the burden of anger and resentment. And this story also highlights the cyclical nature of relationships, don't you think? I mean, the brothers who betrayed Joseph end up bowing down to him for help. It's this powerful reversal of fortune that demonstrates how unpredictable life can be.
It really makes you wonder, hasn't it ever happened in your own life, where you've had to choose between holding on to anger or embracing forgiveness? It's a powerful theme, one that echoes throughout the Old Testament. And it leads us to the Exodus, another pivotal moment in the narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The Exodus is a story of liberation, a testament to God's power to deliver his people from oppression. Moses, chosen by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, is a fascinating figure, isn't he? What are your thoughts on his role as a leader? How do you think he navigated all the complexities of this monumental task?
Well, sometimes he seems like kind of a reluctant leader, constantly questioning God, even arguing with him. Yet he ultimately leads his people through these incredible challenges, parting the Red Sea, wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, receiving the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. It's an epic journey.
What I find so intriguing about Moses is his humanity. He's not this perfect, flawless leader. He experiences doubt, fear, and frustration, and that makes him so relatable. It highlights the fact that even those who are chosen for great purposes grapple with human emotions, just like us. The fact that God works through him, despite his imperfections, well, that's a powerful message in itself.
It does challenge us to embrace our own imperfections, recognize that we don't have to be perfect to be used by God, right? Speaking of imperfections, let's talk about the laws given to Moses at Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments are, well, pretty well known, but the Old Testament is full of other laws, some of which might seem harsh or outdated to a modern audience. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think it's crucial to view these laws through the lens of their historical and cultural context. They were given to a specific people at a specific time, and they reflected the values and societal norms of that era. Some laws, like those related to ritual purity and sacrifice, well, they might seem irrelevant today, but they served a purpose back then. They helped establish a sense of order and holiness within the Israelite community.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly harsh laws with the idea of a loving and merciful God?
That's a question that has challenged theologians and scholars for centuries. One way to approach it, I think, is to look at the underlying principles behind the laws. rather than their literal interpretations. For example, laws against stealing or murder reflect universal values of respect for life and property. Even if the specific punishments outlined in the Old Testament seem outdated, the core principles they represent remain relevant, don't they?
So it's more about understanding the intent, the values behind the laws, rather than getting stuck on the specifics.
Exactly. What are some of the core values you see woven throughout these laws? Values that might still hold meaning for us today?
Well, justice for sure, accountability, living in right relationship with God and one another. These are key themes that emerge, wouldn't you say? I mean, the laws were intended to create a society where everyone was treated fairly and held responsible for their actions. This emphasis on justice and righteousness resonates even today, as we strive to create communities where all people are treated with dignity and respect.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, isn't it, how these ancient laws can still spark conversations about ethics and morality in the 21st century. And speaking of challenging conversations, the Israelites' journey doesn't end with receiving the law at Mount Sinai. They wander through the wilderness for 40 years, facing all sorts of challenges and setbacks. Why do you think this period of wandering is so significant in the narrative? The wilderness wanderings represent a time of testing, of refinement, and spiritual growth, I'd say. It's a period where the Israelites are learning to depend on God's provision to develop their faith. They experience miracles like manna falling from heaven, but also rebellions like the golden calf incident. This highlights, I think, the ongoing tension between faith and doubt, obedience and disobedience, all part of the human experience.
It's like a reminder that even after experiencing a major liberation like the Exodus, life isn't always easy. There are still challenges to face, lessons to learn, and temptations to overcome. Do you think the number 40 years of wandering holds any symbolic significance?
Well, the number 40 appears frequently in the Bible, doesn't it? It often represents a period of testing or transformation. Think of Noah and the 40 days of rain, or Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. It seems to signify a time of intense spiritual struggle and preparation. In the case of the Israelites, it's a period where they're being shaped into a nation, learning to trust God, and grappling with their newfound freedom.
So after 40 years of wandering, they finally reached the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But their arrival isn't exactly peaceful. They have to conquer the land and its inhabitants. Which, well, it raises some tough questions about the concept of holy war and the justification of violence in the name of God. What are your thoughts on this?
The conquest of the Promised Land is definitely one of the most challenging parts of the Old Testament to grapple with. It raises questions about the nature of God, the justification of violence, and the complexities of interpreting these ancient texts through a modern lens.
It can be difficult, can it, to reconcile the idea of a loving and merciful God with the descriptions of warfare and bloodshed in these accounts. How do you approach these challenging passages?
Well, it's important to remember that the Old Testament was written in a specific historical and cultural context. The concept of holy war, where God was seen as actively participating in battles alongside his chosen people, was pretty prevalent in the ancient world. We can't just impose our modern sensibilities onto these ancient texts.
So are you saying we should just accept these accounts of violence at face value?
Not necessarily. I think it's important to engage with these texts critically, to ask tough questions, and to wrestle with the uncomfortable aspects of our faith. We can acknowledge the historical context while also recognizing that these stories can still challenge us. To think deeply about the ethics of war, the nature of power, and the relationship between faith and violence.
These stories certainly don't offer easy answers. They force us to confront some of the most difficult questions of human existence.
That's the power of the Old Testament, though, isn't it? It doesn't shy away from the complexities of life, the struggles, the triumphs, the moral dilemmas. It's like an invitation into a dialogue, a process of wrestling with faith, doubt, and everything in between.
And sometimes those wrestling matches can be pretty intense.
Absolutely. But that's where the growth and understanding can occur. It's in those moments of grappling with the tough questions that our faith can deepen and our perspectives can shift.
We see those struggles play out not just in the larger narratives of nations and wars, but also in the personal stories of individuals. The Old Testament is full of flawed characters, people who make mistakes, face temptations, and wrestle with their own inner demons. What are some examples that come to mind?
One that stands out is the story of King David. He's often portrayed as this heroic figure, a man after God's own heart. But, he also commits adultery with Bathsheba and then orchestrates the death of her husband Uriah to cover up his sin. It's a story that exposes the dark side of human nature, even in those who are considered righteous.
Right? It's a reminder that no one is immune to temptation, and even those who are close to God can make terrible choices. What's fascinating about David's story is that he doesn't get away with his sin. He faces consequences and has to confront the gravity of his actions.
Exactly. The Old Testament doesn't shy away from portraying the consequences of sin. It shows that actions have repercussions, and even those in positions of power are held accountable.
This brings up the whole idea of divine justice, doesn't it? How is it portrayed in the Old Testament, and how does it differ from our modern understanding of justice?
Divine justice in the Old Testament is often portrayed as switched and severe. There's a sense of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But it's not always about punishment, is it? It's also about restoration and maintaining order within the community.
That's an interesting point. So it's not just about retribution, it's about restoring balance and ensuring that wrongdoing doesn't go unchecked.
Precisely. And this concept of justice isn't always easy to reconcile with our modern sensibilities, is it? We tend to emphasize rehabilitation and mercy, whereas the Old Testament often focuses on immediate consequences and the need to uphold a moral order.
It's a reminder that we're viewing these texts through a different cultural lens, and what might have seemed just and fair in ancient times might not align with our current values. But even if the specific punishments seem harsh, the underlying principle of accountability remains relevant.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it, about how our understanding of justice has evolved over time and how those cultural values shape our perceptions of right and wrong. But, shifting gears a bit, we've talked about stories, laws, the concept of justice. What about all those rituals described in the Old Testament? We've got sacrifices, feasts, purification ceremonies. It seems like there was a ritual for almost every aspect of life back then. What was the purpose of these rituals, and what can we learn from them? Well, these rituals, they played a really vital role in the lives of the Israelites. I mean, they weren't just empty actions, they were expressions of faith, of devotion, and a desire to connect with God. They provided a framework for understanding the sacred and for navigating the complexities of life and death, sin and forgiveness.
I see. It's interesting how rituals can create a sense of order, of meaning, even in the face of the unknown. Can you give us an example of a ritual that stands out to you as particularly meaningful or insightful?
Well, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, that's a powerful example, I think. It's a day of fasting, repentance, and seeking forgiveness for sins. The high priest would perform these elaborate rituals, including sacrificing animals and entering the Holy of Holies, which was, the most sacred space in the tabernacle. It was a day of really intense spiritual reflection and renewal for the entire community.
Yeah, even though we don't practice these rituals in the same way today, the concept of atonement, of seeking forgiveness and making amends for our wrongs, it still resonates, doesn't it? It's like this universal human need to acknowledge our imperfections, to seek reconciliation.
Absolutely. The Day of Atonement, it reminds us that we all fall short, we all make mistakes, and we all need forgiveness. It points to a deeper truth about the human condition, don't you think? Our need for redemption, our desire to be in right relationship with God, and, well, with each other.
It's fascinating how these ancient rituals can still speak to us across, well, millennia. They tap into something so fundamental about the human experience, our longing for meaning, for connection, a sense of belonging. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from creation to covenants, laws to rituals, betrayals to forgiveness. As we wrap up, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that the Old Testament, it's not just a collection of ancient stories. It's a living document, one that continues to challenge and inspire us. It's a source of wisdom, of insight, moral guidance. It invites us to wrestle with these big questions about life, about faith, about justice, and, well, the human condition.
It's a reminder that the human experience is messy, complex, and full of contradictions. But even in the midst of all our struggles and failures, there's a God who loves us, guides us, and offers us hope.
That's beautifully put. And as we conclude our deep dive into the Old Testament, I just want to encourage you to keep exploring these texts, to wrestle with their complexities, and to discover the wisdom and insights they hold for your own life. The journey doesn't end here. It's just the beginning.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Old Testament. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit challenging. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking wisdom wherever you may find it. CAFO.